Eli Asenbaugh here, and I decided to do my presentation and paper on the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization Supreme Court case. Um, let's just hop right into my thesis statement here before we get started. The Supreme Court incorrectly overturned Roe v. Wade and the Planned Parenthood versus Casey with their decision in the Dobbs case. They ignored precedent, they weakened constitutional protections in women's rights, and ignored historical foundations of privacy rights. Some of the facts of the case here, real quickly, we'll breeze through this. Mississippi law passed the Gestational Age Act, which banned abortions with few exceptions after a 15-week gestational period. Jackson Women's Health Organization, abortion was the only licensed abortion clinic in the state of Mississippi, and one of their doctors filed a lawsuit in district court challenging the law and requesting a temporary restraining order against the law. The district court did in fact grant the temporary restraining order while litigation proceeded to discovery. And after discovery, district court granted the clinic's motion for summary judgment and enjoined the Mississippi from enforcing that law. They stated the state provided not enough evidence that a fetus would be viable at 15 weeks, and Supreme Court precedent prohibits states from banning abortions prior to viability. Those precedents cases we will talk about here in a second. The court opinion in conclusion here is that Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood of Pennsylvania versus Casey, which both those cases we'll discuss, were overturned. The Constitution does not mention abortion, therefore abortion should be left to the states to decide. And they also said the right is not deeply rooted in the nation's history nor an essential component of liberty. We will kind of argue against that here as we move on. One of the cases here that was overturned by the Dobbs v. Jackson case is Roe v. Wade, probably one of the more famous Supreme Court cases that a lot of you know about. But Roe v. Wade, 1970, Jane Roe filed a lawsuit against Henry Wade, who was the district attorney of Dallas County, Texas. Lawsuit challenged Texas law that made abortion illegal except by doctor's orders to save a woman's life. Roe alleged that the state law were unconstitutionally vague and abridged her right of personal privacy protected by the First, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and 14th Amendments. The other case that was overturned by the Dobbs decision was the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case. In this one, law required informed consent in a 24-hour waiting period prior to the procedure. Also required a minor seeking abortion to have consent of one parent, and married women to indicate that they had notified their husband before the procedure. Provisions were challenged by several abortion clinics. Eventually reached the Supreme Court, and in a tight 5-4 decision, the court reaffirmed Roe v. Wade, but upheld most of the Pennsylvania provisions except for the one about spousal notification before an abortion. That was one that might have placed an undue burden standard of review, which we will talk about here in a second. One thing I forgot to mention about the Roe v. Wade case, let's just backtrack here a second, was that Roe v. Wade required the courts to evaluate abortion cases under strict scrutiny. So strict scrutiny holds that a challenged law as presumptively invalid unless the government can demonstrate that the law or regulation is necessary to achieve a compelling state interest, and it is the highest and most stringent standard of judicial review. So any abortion cases after Roe v. Wade had to be looked at under strict scrutiny, and that was changed with the Planned Parenthood versus Casey. They are now using an undue burden standard of review. And under this standard, this new standard asks whether a state abortion regulation has the purpose or effect of imposing an undue burden, which is defined as a substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion. After review, the Supreme Court said that the only provision of Pennsylvania law that created an undue burden was, in fact, the the spousal notification one. Um, we're going to kind of talk about how these cases relate here to my argument in my thesis statement and look at some legal analysis here. So stare decisis should have preserved stability and public trust. Stare decisis refers to a court decision that is considered an authority for deciding subsequent cases involving identical or similar facts or similar legal issues. So obviously Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey are both precedents for the Dobbs decision. The precedents, the decisions in Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey had established abortion as a liberty and a right that a woman should possess. Even though it's not stated in the Constitution, those two cases had made abortion, accessible to everyone in the United States, not just on a state-by-state basis. The court completely ignored precedent in the Dobbs cases, completely ignored Roe v. Wade and the Planned Parenthood versus Casey and overturning them. I don't think, precedent is should never be overturned, but in this case, I think it should have preserved the stability and the public trust. The right to privacy is intertwined in this case. So yes, the Griswold versus Connecticut case, I think, is a big one that we can kind of connect to and support our argument. The Griswold versus Connecticut case was a case about contraception and women's, in couples' access to contraception. And they pretty much said that the right to privacy can be inferred from several amendments in the Bill of Rights, and this prevents states from making use of contraception illegal. The Constitution does not explicitly protect a general right to privacy. The various guarantees in the Bill of Rights create penumbras that establish the right to privacy. I think the same thing can be said about the Dobbs versus Jackson's Health and Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood. Even though we've kind of talked about how those cases are not, or how abortion is not explicitly stated in the Constitution, it is inferred from other rights like the 14th Amendment, in the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. So the Equal Protection Clause deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So if abortion is a state-by-state law and not a national law, then I don't think the Equal Protection Clause is going to apply to people that are in abortion illegal states. They are not going to have the equal protection of the laws that someone in an abortion illegal state might have. The Due Process Clause is another one, prohibits the deprivation of life, liberty, or property by federal and state governments without due process of the law. I think the decision in the Dobbs case is definitely prohibiting the deprivation of life, liberty, and property, and it by federal and by state governments. So if state governments are going to outlaw abortion, it's going to, they're not going to get equal protection or due process under the 14th Amendment. So, moving on here. Another one is Roe and Casey were rooted in substantive due process jurisprudence. So substantive due process is the principle that allows courts to establish and protect substantive laws and certain fundamental rights from government interference, even if they are not stated in the Constitution. That is the key word in substantive due process, even if they are not stated in the Constitution, like abortion is. Yes, it is not stated in the Constitution, but we have established in Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey that it is, a fundamental right, and that government should not be able to interfere with that fundamental right. So yeah, Roe and Casey were rooted in substantive due process, and obviously with the Dobbs decision that just completely reversed 50 years of precedents that we had already seen with Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So yes, did that one already. Let's talk about some historical analysis. So yes, the prompt for the paper here in the presentation was talking about a Warren Court case being overturned. The Warren Court was a period between 1953 and 1969 when Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Warren Court really expanded on civil rights, civil liberties, and judicial power. The Warren Court brought one man, one vote, and also brought Miranda rights. It also brought into de jure racial segregation, incorporating the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment due process laws, and ended voluntary prayer in public schools. So a lot of what the Warren Court was doing was expanding those civil rights and civil liberties and judicial power post Reconstruction. They were a lot of the times, like we talked about in Griswold versus Connecticut, they were extending rights to people that maybe were not explicitly stated in the Constitution, like the right to privacy, the right to the use of contraception, things like that. The Warren Court really did a good job on granting and extending those rights. Yes, we talked a little bit about the 14th Amendment in the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause and how those were kind of violated with the Dobbs decision. The 14th Amendment was really about responding to issues affecting the freeing of slaves, granting them citizenship and equal protection and due process. The Dobbs decision just kind of went away from everything that Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment was going for. It was taking away rights and taking away some of the women's access to different things. And yeah, like I said, Dobbs was a complete reversal of the trajectory of the Warren Court and the trajectory of the United States post-Reconstruction and post-14th Amendment. Implications of the Dobbs decision. Obviously, abortion is going to be a huge topic that will probably never stop being debated. It does have impacts on rights not explicitly stated in the Constitution, like maybe the use of contraception, like we have seen recently after the Dobbs decision. We've seen states and government try to limit the access to birth control and things like that, things that were already established as a fundamental right, especially in Griswold versus Connecticut. In the future of substantive due process rights, like we kind of talked about with contraception, which is those rights that aren't explicitly stated in the Constitution. I mean, Dobbs might, the Dobbs decision can have an effect on those rights, especially for women. Just to wrap everything up for you guys, that's all I have on my slide. But in conclusion, yes, I do think that the courts made the wrong decision in overturning Roe v. Wade in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey in the Dobbs court case. I think it's due to stare decisis and judicial precedents. The fundamental right to privacy that we saw in Griswold versus Connecticut, in the fundamental right to have an abortion, that even though it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, it can be inferred from penumbras and other things in the Bill of Rights, just like in the Griswold versus Connecticut case. And also the due process and equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment is a big reason why I think the court was incorrect in overturning them. They are, in fact, denying people within their jurisdiction the right to equal protection of the laws. Someone might be able to get an abortion in one state, but someone in another state might not be able to get one. So that is denying equal protection to individuals. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. That's all I got for you guys.